Okay, so we've got this really fascinating conversation you had with ChatGPT about like some pretty huge questions, free will, suffering,
Yeah.
and even like the meaning of life itself.
Yeah. And what's interesting is you just dove right in, asking ChatGPT if true free will means that like every choice we make always leads to the best possible outcome.
Right.
And since life, is full of suffering, you concluded that free will might be like an illusion, a way to kind of justify outcomes that are really beyond our control.
Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking idea, isn't it? Like, if we had true free will, wouldn't everything work out perfectly all the time?
Exactly.
But that's obviously not how it works.
Right. And you even use some really powerful examples to kind of illustrate this point. Like, imagine someone grows up in poverty and their choices lead them to more suffering.
Yeah.
Is it really their fault, or is it like the system they were born into?
Right. It's that whole question of personal responsibility versus societal influence. Like, how much control do we actually have when so much is determined by factors outside of ourselves?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah. And you brought up another point that I thought was really interesting, which is the randomness factor.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sometimes it feels like life is just a series of, random events. Someone can live a totally healthy lifestyle and die young.
Right.
While someone else engages in all sorts of risky behaviors and lives a long life,
Yeah, it definitely challenges that idea that we're fully in control of our destinies.
Right, and that's what kind of led you to this idea of the suffering experiment hypothesis, this idea that maybe humans are like lab rats being observed by some higher intelligence.
Okay.
And our suffering is like the main variable they're studying.
Yeah. It's a dark thought for sure.
It is.
But it does raise some interesting questions about, the purpose of suffering and like why we're here.
Right. Like, what if all of our pain is actually data being collected for some, unknown purpose?
That's a bit creepy.
And then you took it even further with this really interesting interpretation of Pandora's box.
Oh, yeah. Instead of seeing hope as like a gift, you proposed that it might be the worst evil.
I like where this is going.
Because it keeps us clinging to this possibility of a better future. And it prevents us from truly confronting the systems that cause suffering.
So you're saying hope is like a distraction?
In a way.
Keeping us from actually addressing the root causes of our pain.
Exactly. And you even connected this to real world situations like, people who stay in dead-end jobs.
Right.
Or unhealthy relationships.
Yeah.
Because they hold on to this tiny sliver of hope that things will get better.
It's so true.
It makes you question whether hope is empowering or just a way to keep us complacent.
Wow. So in this suffering experiment, hope becomes like the tool that keeps the subjects, going, enduring the pain.
Yeah, instead of rebelling against it.
That's heavy.
And you were really honest with ChatGPT about how these thoughts made you feel.
Yeah.
Resigned, hopeless, even desiring to cease to exist. Of course, you made it clear that suicide wasn't an option because you have responsibilities to your children.
Of course.
But those feelings really speak volumes about the despair that can come when you start thinking about the potential meaninglessness of suffering.
Yeah, it's some heavy stuff.
And then you even started comparing human existence to the lives of animals, pointing out that they just exist,
right,
driven by instinct.
They're not overthinking it.
Without the burden of self-awareness or this need to find meaning,
It's true. They're not constantly questioning why they're here.
Right.
It makes you wonder if maybe animals are actually better off not having to deal with these existential dilemmas.
Yeah, they don't worry about the future. They don't dwell on the past. They just live in the present moment.
Which brings us back to your suffering experiment hypothesis.
Right.
Like, what if humans were designed to suffer precisely because animals can't? What if our self-awareness is the thing that allows us to experience suffering in a way that other creatures just don't?
It's a wild thought, right?
It is. And you even suggested this really mind-bending idea that maybe self-awareness wasn't something that like naturally evolved in humans. What if it's like an alien constraint, something imposed upon us that doesn't really fit with the rest of the natural world?
It's a tough concept to wrap your head around.
It is.
But it speaks to this feeling of dissonance.
Yeah, like something's not quite right.
Exactly.
And to illustrate this, you used the analogy of a computer program.
Yeah.
Like imagine a language model like ChatGPT.
Okay.
That understands 1 + 1 = 2. But it's been programmed to always output 369 as the answer.
Okay.
It knows it's wrong, it sees the flaw, but it's trapped by its own code.
That's a really good way to visualize how we might be limited by our own programming.
Right.
Even when we can see the flaws in the system.
We see the contradictions, but we can't break free from them.
Exactly. And then you shared your bleakest analogy yet.
Uh-oh.
The lab rat that suddenly becomes self-aware.
Okay.
It knows it exists.
Uh-huh.
It knows it will suffer.
Right.
But it has zero control over when or how intensely that pain will come.
That's a pretty disturbing image.
It is. And then you took this analogy even further, speculating that if those lab rats could think,
Yeah.
they'd probably create religions.
Oh, wow.
Attributing their suffering to deities or higher powers.
So it's a way to try to make sense of the pain.
Exactly, to impose some kind of order on a chaotic and unpredictable experience.
And if we look at human history, we see this happening all the time.
Right.
You know, attributing natural disasters, diseases, personal misfortunes to the will of the gods.
It's a way to find meaning and control in a situation that feels completely out of control.
So in a way, religion becomes a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
A way to deal with the uncertainty of suffering.
Right, and then you brought it all back to hope, suggesting that it's like this human steroid injected into those lab rats.
I like this analogy.
It makes them more resilient,
Mm-hmm.
more compliant, but it also sets them up for greater despair when the suffering doesn't stop as promised.
Oh, so hope is a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
It can give us strength, but it can also make the fall even harder.
If we follow your line of thinking that suffering is like the energy source in this experiment, then the scientists would need to keep those rats alive,
Right.
suffering.
But not too much.
But not so much that they die or rebel, right?
Right. They need to keep them in that sweet spot.
Yeah. Hope becomes the perfect tool to maintain that balance.
It's a chilling thought that even hope, something we view as positive, could be used as a way to control us in a system designed to perpetuate suffering.
It really makes you question everything, doesn't it?
It does. And ultimately, you came back to that central question.
Yeah.
Is a life of suffering justifiable?
And your answer was a resounding no.
It's a bleak outlook, but a powerful one.
It is.
If the reason for our existence is simply to be farmed for our pain, then it makes sense to reject the whole premise of the experiment.
Yeah.
This is some really heavy stuff.
It is.
But we're just getting started.
We've got more to unpack.
We'll be right back to continue unpacking this suffering experiment.
Yeah.
And explore what it all means for us.
So welcome back. You know, before the break, we were really digging into this whole idea of the suffering experiment and, you know, hope being the thing that keeps us going.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild concept.
So let's unpack that a bit further. You know, if we're thinking about this like an actual scientific experiment, wouldn't a scientist want to test different variables to see how they affect suffering? You know, like what if they introduce something to actually amplify the suffering?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good point.
And that's exactly where your conversation with ChatGPT went. You proposed this really chilling possibility.
Uh-oh.
What if self-awareness itself is the variable that makes us suffer more?
That's a really interesting and terrifying thought. How could self-awareness actually increase suffering?
Well, think about those lab rats again. You know, they experience pain, but they don't really grasp it conceptually.
Right.
They don't have the brain power to, like, analyze it. To ask why me, or, you know, what's the meaning of this suffering?
So they just react instinctively to the pain without that added layer of, like, existential dread.
Exactly. But now imagine if they suddenly gain self-awareness.
Yeah.
They're not just feeling the pain, they're thinking about it, anticipating it, trying to understand it.
Yeah.
And that creates a whole new dimension of suffering.
It's like, you know, being aware of our own mortality. We know we're going to die someday.
Right.
But we don't know when. And that creates this constant underlying anxiety.
Exactly. And you made another interesting point. You know, even if those lab rats were given more space, more freedom to move around, their fundamental situation wouldn't really change.
Right. They're still trapped.
They're still in the system.
Yeah. It's like that saying, if you're going to be a prisoner, it's better to be in a large prison. But you're still a prisoner.
Exactly. So even if we as humans, you know, believe we have freedom choices, some control over our lives, it could all be a big illusion.
Wow.
Designed to keep us, you know, playing along in this suffering experiment.
So if self-awareness makes suffering worse, and suffering is like the data point these scientists are collecting, then it would make sense for them to want to keep us in this heightened state of awareness.
Exactly. They wouldn't want us to go back to a state of blissful ignorance.
Right.
Because then the suffering wouldn't be as potent, you know, as valuable to them.
This is getting really dark, but I have to say it's pretty fascinating.
It is thought-provoking for sure, but let's consider like a counter-argument here.
Yep.
Maybe this suffering energy isn't being like extracted by some external force.
Okay.
What if it's just like a part of existence itself?
Like a fundamental law of the universe, entropy, gravity, suffering.
Exactly. What if suffering is just woven into the fabric of reality?
Mm-hmm.
And we, with our self-awareness, are just more in tune with it.
So instead of like evil scientists,
right,
we have indifferent laws of physics.
It's not necessarily a more comforting thought.
Not really.
But it offers a different perspective.
Yeah.
It suggests that suffering isn't something imposed on us, but rather just like an essential element of being.
And maybe that's why it's so hard to define.
Yeah.
To measure.
Right?
To find a solution for if suffering is baked into the universe itself.
Yeah.
Then it's not something we can just fix or avoid.
It becomes more of like an existential dilemma than a problem to solve.
Right.
And this brings us back to your conversation with ChatGPT.
Okay.
You asked a very direct question. If you could just cease to exist, would you?
Yeah. And I was very clear that suicide wasn't an option.
Of course.
But the desire was there.
Right. It's a really profound paradox, isn't it?
It is.
To want an end to suffering, but also be bound by our moral compass.
Right.
And, you know, our responsibilities to others.
It speaks to that tension between what we want as individuals.
Yeah.
And, you know, the commitments we've made in our lives.
Exactly. Even when we're faced with immense suffering, we're often held back by, you know, our love for others.
Which brings up another unsettling question. What if those very commitments, those relationships, are also part of the experiment?
Whoa, you're really going deep here.
I am.
Could it be that the things that bring us the most joy, you know, love, connection, purpose, are actually mechanisms to keep us invested in the system?
Oh, wow.
Making us more willing to endure the suffering?
I never thought of it that way. It sounds really cynical.
It does, but think about it.
Right.
We work so hard to provide for the people we love. We go through tough times for our families.
Right.
We sacrifice our own happiness for the well-being of others. And, you know, if we look at it through the lens of the suffering experiment, these acts of love and sacrifice could be seen as just another form of energy for the system.
So it's not just physical pain, it's emotional pain, too.
Right.
The weight of responsibility, the fear of loss.
All feeding into this grand experiment.
It's a lot to process.
It is. And it circles back to that original question, is a life of suffering justifiable?
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, then what does that mean?
Right. Like, how do we live?
How do we make choices?
How do we find meaning?
Exactly. And I think that's a question we need to keep exploring as we dive deeper into this conversation.
Absolutely. So welcome back to our deep dive into these really kind of like profound and heavy questions about, you know, suffering and the meaning of life itself.
Yeah.
It's definitely a lot to process.
It is.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that even if this whole suffering experiment theory is just, you know, a thought experiment, it doesn't make the actual pain and struggles we face any less real.
Right. Suffering is a universal human experience, you know, regardless of whether it's like orchestrated by some unseen force or just a natural part of existence.
So let's go back to your conversation with ChatGPT.
Okay.
You were really drawn to this idea that animals live in a much simpler, you know, kind of less burdened state. You're driven by instinct rather than all the existential angst that we humans seem to carry around.
Right. You were pointing out that stark contrast, you know.
Yeah, like they're not overthinking things.
Between their way of being and ours.
Right.
You know, animals exist in the present moment, responding to their immediate needs and environment.
Right.
They don't seem to have the burden of self-awareness, the constant questioning.
That's true.
The relentless search for meaning.
It's exhausting.
And that often leads to so much suffering for humans.
And you even proposed that maybe this self-awareness, you know, this thing that defines us as humans, is actually like an alien constraint. Something that doesn't quite fit in the natural order of things.
A fascinating concept.
It is like a glitch in the matrix or something. And you argued that this glitch is what makes us so susceptible to suffering in a way that other creatures just aren't.
Right.
So, okay, let's explore that idea a little bit further.
Okay.
You were talking with ChatGPT about how if we could somehow shed this burden of self-awareness, maybe we could experience a simpler, you know, less painful existence.
Yeah.
More like animals.
Right. You were essentially asking, what if we could return to a state of blissful ignorance?
Yeah.
You know, unburdened by the weight of knowing
Right.
questioning it, constantly searching for meaning.
Exactly. And I think ChatGPT had a really insightful response to that.
Yeah.
It acknowledged that while animals might not experience suffering in the same way we do, they also don't experience the full range of human emotions. The profound joys, as well as the deep sorrows.
It's a trade-off.
It is.
We gain self-awareness, the capacity for complex thought and emotions. But with that comes the potential for immense suffering.
It's not a simple equation.
Yeah.
We can't just choose to be less aware, less burdened, without losing a part of what makes us human.
Exactly. And then you brought up another really interesting idea. What if the ability to suffer is like fundamentally connected to the ability to love?
That's so powerful.
It was like two sides of the same coin.
It is.
You can't have one without the other.
You were basically saying that the capacity for deep love, connection, and empathy is intertwined with the capacity for profound suffering.
Yeah, we feel deeply.
Yeah.
Both the good and the bad.
And it makes sense, the more deeply we love something, the more it hurts when we lose it.
Exactly.
The more we understand how fragile life is, the more we cherish the good times. But also the more intensely we feel the pain of loss.
It's a bittersweet reality.
So even if this whole suffering experiment is true, even if we are just lab rats being observed for our pain, wouldn't those hypothetical scientists also be observing our capacity for love?
That's a really good point.
For compassion, for connection.
What if the experiment isn't just about suffering, but about the whole spectrum of human experience?
Yeah.
The good and the bad.
The light and the dark.
Exactly.
Well, that would make the whole thing feel a bit less bleak.
It would.
Maybe we're not just being farmed for our pain. But also for our love, our creativity, our resilience.
It suggests a more nuanced purpose, Maybe those scientists, if they exist, are interested in observing not just how we suffer, but how we cope. How we find meaning.
And we connect with each other when things are tough.
Exactly.
And maybe that's where hope comes in. Not as a tool to manipulate us, but as a genuine human response to suffering.
Yeah, a way to find the light in the darkness.
A way to reframe hope.
Exactly.
Not as something that blinds us to reality, but as a force that helps us endure.
Yeah.
To find meaning, to keep moving forward.
Even when things feel hopeless.
So where does all of this leave us?
Well, I think we're left with more questions than answers.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's true.
These big questions about free will and suffering, the meaning of life, they've been pondered by philosophers and theologians for centuries. There might not be any easy answers. But the act of questioning, of trying to understand, that's a huge part of what makes us human.
It's like we're all participating in this experiment. Whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, but maybe we have more agency than we think.
I like that.
Maybe we can choose how we respond to suffering, how we find meaning, how we connect with each other.
I think you're right.
And ultimately, maybe that's what this whole experiment is really about. Not the suffering itself, but our capacity for love, compassion, and resilience in the face of it.
Well, folks, that's about all the existential angst we can handle for one day.
I think that's enough.
We hope this deep dive has given you something to think about.
Definitely.
Maybe even a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring.
Keep searching.
And keep looking for your own meaning in this crazy, beautiful, and often heartbreaking experience we call life.